Hey guys, welcome back to Oop All History, where we take history's strangest corners, drag them into the candlelight, and then tell the story so slowly that by the time we're done, you might already be half asleep. Tonight, we're going to talk about something that sounds both very practical and very uncomfortable. How much did Roman slaves actually cost? Yes, we're diving into the economy of human beings, which feels grim enough to make you want to hug your pillow a little tighter. But don't worry, we're going to keep this in that gentle, sleepy tone. Imagine it, less like a financial lecture, and more like someone whispering weird facts into your ear while you curled up under a blanket. So, let's set the scene. Ancient Rome, bustling streets, the smell of bread and olives drifting from bakeries, the distant shouts of street vendors selling wine diluted with who knows what. In that crowd, there's also another kind of marketplace, the slave market. It wasn't a hidden thing, it was out there, public, in the middle of daily life. People were bought and sold like cattle, with prices that depended on age, skills, looks, and sometimes even personality. Imagine a Roman casually saying, "Yes, I'll take that one, please, and how much extra if he can read." That was real. It's jarring to think of, but that's exactly how normalized slavery was in the Roman world. Now, let's start with some numbers. Because the Romans, being very organized people when they weren't stabbing each other in the Senate, left us plenty of little hints about money. The basic unit of currency was the denarius, a silver coin that a Roman legionary might earn as daily pay. To give you some scale, a loaf of bread could cost less than half a denarius, a cheap cup of wine about the same. So when we talk about slaves costing hundreds or even thousands of denarii, you can imagine how huge a purchase it was. The cheapest slaves were often considered unskilled laborers, maybe captured in war or taken from some poor village. These could go for just a few hundred denarius, say 300 to 500 too, which would still be about a year's salary for a regular Roman soldier. That's already massive. Now think about the skilled ones: cooks, musicians, scribes, teachers, doctors. Those were luxury items. A talented Greek tutor, for example, could sell for 10,000 to 20,000 denarii, maybe even more if he had that wise philosopher vibe. Imagine being so expensive that your owner brags about you at dinner parties like, "Oh yes, my slave reads Plato out loud for the children every night. Only cost me the equivalent of a small villa." And then there were the specialists. Gladiators, for instance. If you were a strong, scary-looking person who could draw a crowd in the arena, your price tag went up like crazy. A well-trained gladiator might cost 1,000 denarii or more, because they were investments. Owners expected them to fight, attract crowds, and bring in gambling profits. It's grim, but it's also business, Roman style. Women were also valued differently depending on role. A young, attractive girl might fetch a very high price, not only for domestic labor, but sadly for the darker side of Roman society, the brothel trade. Prices for those girls could be thousands of denarii, and they were often dressed up, displayed, and sold like luxury goods. Meanwhile, older or less desirable slaves could be bought for cheaper, sometimes for kitchen work or farm labor. But here's the thing. The price was on just about the person. It was also about the time in history. During times of war, when Rome had just conquered some new land and dragged thousands of captives back, the markets were flooded and prices dropped. Suddenly you could buy a strong young man for way cheaper, simply because there were too many of them to sell. Picture a Roman bargain hunter wandering through the slave market like, "Wow, 2 for 1 on goals today. What a deal." It's horrifying, but that's how supply and demand worked, in a world where people were treated as property. Now, let's put this into modern perspective, because otherwise the numbers just float around. Historians estimate that 1 denarius could be loosely compared to about 20 to 30 modern US dollars in terms of purchasing power, though it's always tricky to translate ancient money. So a basic unskilled slave might cost the modern equivalent of $10,000 or more, while a highly educated Greek tutor could be worth hundreds of thousands. That's the kind of range we're talking about. Basically, buying a slave could be like buying a car or a whole mansion, depending on who you were buying. And of course, slaves weren't just bought, they were maintained. Owners had to feed them, clothe them, sometimes train them. This made slaves both a major upfront investment and an ongoing cost. Some owners treated them terribly because they saw them as disposable. Others treated them a bit better, not out of kindness but because they wanted to protect their investment. A sick slave was a waste of money. A well-trained, well-fed one could bring in profits. That was the cold, brutal math of Roman slavery. Now, imagine being in one of those marketplaces. The slave dealer might line people up, sometimes even with signs around their necks listing their qualities, like age, 18, knows how to cook, doesn't speak Latin yet, but strong arms. It's chilling, but it was reality. Buyers would walk along, inspect teeth, muscles, sometimes even scars. Prices went up or down based on what they saw. One thing that's interesting is that the Romans sometimes used auctions. Picture a crowd of wealthy men raising their hands, bidding higher and higher, while some poor captured soldier just stands there silently, not understanding a word. That's where the really expensive slaves, the rare ones, got sold. But not all slaves were sold at glamorous auctions. Plenty were traded in dusty side streets, in private deals, or bundled together in bulk. Farmers might buy groups of strong men for the fields, while city households might purchase just one or two for kitchen or cleaning duties. The variety of packages was huge. And here's another layer. Sometimes the price wasn't money at all. Romans could exchange goods, services, even property in trade for slaves. It wasn't always a cash deal. You might give up a piece of land in exchange for a skilled worker. That meant slave prices were tied deeply into every corner of Roman economics. So, to sum up this first sleepy stretch of our journey, Roman slaves weren't cheap, not by any means. Even the lowest priced ones were major investments, while the highly skilled or beautiful ones could cost fortunes. Prices shifted with wars, with supply, with fashion even. And behind all of this, behind every price tag, was a human life, reduced to numbers and silver coins. That's the unsettling reality. But hey, don't close your eyes yet. We've got 19 more chunks to unravel. We'll drift through the markets, the household accounts, the bragging letters of Roman elites, all to see just how tangled the world of slave pricing really was. And trust me, there's plenty of detail still to come. If you imagine yourself standing in that Roman marketplace a little longer, the sound of coins clinking, voices haggling, and the shuffle of sandaled feet, you start to see how ordinary this was to them. To us, it feels horrifying. But for a Roman aristocrat or even a middle-class merchant, it was just part of life. Slaves weren't rare exotic things. They were everywhere: households, farms, mines, even government offices. And because they were everywhere, prices had layers, like peeling an onion. One of the most important factors in the price was origin. Where did the slave come from? Romans were snobs about this. A Greek slave. Ah, that's premium. Educated, cultured, maybe even knew philosophy or literature. A Gaul or Germanic captive. Strong, hardy, good for physical labor, maybe intimidating enough to put in gladiatorial training. An Eastern slave from Syria or Judea, perhaps skilled in crafts, textiles, or medicine. The stereotypes ran deep, and those stereotypes shaped the market value. A Roman buyer might literally say, "This one's Greek, so he'll make a fine teacher," without ever testing the poor man's knowledge. The assumption itself inflated the price. Another factor, age. Children could be sold cheaply, sometimes in groups, but they were also considered long-term investments. Train them young, shape them to the household's needs, and they could serve for decades. Young adults, especially in their prime, were the most expensive. Old slaves, by contrast, were far cheaper, sometimes sold off at clearance prices like worn-out tools. There's even evidence that some old or sick slaves were abandoned in temples dedicated to healing. Gods basically dropped off, like broken property, with the faint hope a deity would fix them. It's one of those details that makes you shake your head in disbelief, but that was the logic of the system. And then there's skills. Skills were the Roman equivalent of adding shiny upgrades to a purchase. A slave who could read and write Latin or Greek was instantly more valuable. Literacy wasn't common, so someone who could handle accounts, copy documents, or teach children became an asset worth thousands of denarii. Doctors were even more expensive. Yes, many Roman doctors were technically slaves or freedmen. Imagine paying a fortune for someone who could reset bones, mix herbs, and perform surgery with iron tools that look terrifying to us now. That slave could literally save your life, so their price reflected that. Musicians and entertainers also fetched high prices. A skilled harpist, a flutist, or even an actor could become part of a wealthy household's dinner entertainment. Romans loved to show off during banquets, and nothing said luxury like having your very own musician play softly while your guests drank wine. Some wealthy Romans even collected performers like living trophies, the way someone today might collect rare cars. Imagine the awkward conversations. "Oh, you have one harpist. That's nice. I have three, plus a Syrian who can juggle torches." The competitiveness of Roman elites drove prices sky high, but not every slave was treated like rare treasure. The majority were bought for hard labor, farming, mining, construction. These slaves were cheaper, but their lives were brutal. In the mines especially, life expectancy was short, so owners didn't bother investing much in them. If one died, you just bought another. It's chilling to realize how disposable they were considered. Even then, the cost still mattered. A mine owner might calculate how many denarii he'd spend on a group of slaves versus how much silver or iron they could dig up before they collapsed. It was all numbers to them. Now, if you think about gladiators, the story becomes more complex. A slave sold to a gladiator school called the ludus might be cheap at first, especially if he was a captured soldier. But once trained, once he survived a few matches and gained a reputation, his value skyrocketed. Gladiators were like living sports stars. A popular one could be worth thousands and thousands of denarii, and their owners guarded them carefully. Some gladiators were even rented out for huge sums, with owners pocketing the profits. The spectacle of blood and sand wasn't just entertainment, it was economics, with human bodies as the investments. Another twist: female slaves. Their pricing often intersected with beauty standards and exploitation. A woman considered attractive could be sold for a very high price, especially into brothels or private households. Roman writers, often annoyingly casual about it, mention how well-favored girls fetched premium sums. On the other hand, women trained in weaving, spinning, or household management also carried value. Running a Roman villa required organization, and a skilled female servant could keep the whole household functioning smoothly. Her price reflected that too. And yes, Romans had a sense of fashion even in slavery. At certain times, particular skills or origins were in style. Greek tutors might be all the rage one decade, Syrian perfumers another. This meant the cost wasn't fixed. It was part economy, part trend. Almost like today, when one type of gadget suddenly becomes hot and prices soar. Except here, tragically, it was people being treated like products. The Roman state itself also influenced prices. After big wars, like the conquest of Gaul under Julius Caesar, the market was suddenly overflowing with new slaves. Prices dropped dramatically because there was just too much supply. Some accounts even suggest that slaves were so cheap after certain wars that almost anyone could afford one. Even lower-class Romans who normally couldn't dream of it. But then, in more peaceful times, when supply slowed, prices went up again. You could almost track the ebb and flow of Roman history by watching slave prices rise and fall. And of course, there were taxes and fees involved. Dealers made profits, middlemen took their cuts, and sometimes the state imposed levies on sales. This meant that the final price wasn't just the cost of the slave, but also the markups. It was an entire industry, feeding into the broader Roman economy. The thing to remember, as we let all these numbers drift around like coins on a tavern table, is that behind every calculation was a person. A teenager captured from a faraway village, a soldier dragged in chains after losing a battle, a child separated from parents. To the Romans, these people were assets. To us, they're reminders of how deeply normalized cruelty can become when it's woven into an economy. And as unsettling as that is, it's also fascinating, because it shows us how Rome functioned. Slavery wasn't just background noise, it was the engine. The cost of a slave wasn't just a price tag, it was a symbol of how dependent Rome was on forced labor. Every villa, every road, every arena, every piece of Roman culture you can imagine had slave labor behind it. And that meant prices mattered, because without those transactions, Rome, as we know it, wouldn't have existed. So the question of how much did Roman slaves cost is really the question of how much Rome itself cost, how much human lives were turned into currency to keep that empire running. And as we sink deeper into this sleepy tale, we'll see that the story gets even more tangled. From legal contracts to manumission, from auctions to private negotiations, all of it tied to the cold math of silver coins. When you think of buying a person in ancient Rome, you might imagine a single transaction, a buyer handing over coins, a dealer handing over a slave, and then that's it. But in reality, the process was much more complicated. There were contracts, guarantees, and even return policies. Yes, you could actually return a slave if they turned out to be faulty, like sending back a cracked vase to the shop. The Romans had a very legalistic society, and everything, even the sale of human beings, was wrapped in rules. A slave dealer couldn't just say, "Here's a strong young man, trust me." No, the buyer wanted assurances. If the slave turned out to have epilepsy, or ran away, or had hidden defects, the buyer could sue the dealer. Imagine the absurdity of a Roman standing in court saying, "This slave wasn't worth the 1,200 denarii I paid. He snores too loudly and refuses to plow the fields." And yet, these cases happened. It shows how even within the cruelty, there was bureaucracy. Part of this legal system was something called the Edilician Edict. The aediles were officials who oversaw markets, and they set rules to protect buyers. Dealers had to declare important facts about the slaves they sold, whether they were healthy, whether they were prone to running away, whether they had criminal records. Yes, a slave could have a criminal past, and that lowered their value. Buyers wanted stability, not troublemakers. So if a dealer lied, if he said, "This one's obedient and healthy," but it turned out otherwise, the buyer had grounds to return the purchase or demand a partial refund. Of course, this meant the price tag reflected not just the slave's qualities but also the guarantees attached. A healthy, obedient, literate young man with no history of running away was a premium package, but one with a bad reputation, or scars from punishment, or signs of illness, went for far less. The marketplace wasn't just physical, it was reputational. Now think about how families were involved. Sometimes whole groups of slaves were sold together, parents with children, siblings side by side. But the Romans didn't always honor those ties. If a buyer only wanted one or two from the group, the rest could be separated. This wasn't just emotional cruelty, also affected prices. A family unit might sell for less per person than individuals, because buyers didn't always want the extra baggage. So, in a cold economic sense, it could actually be cheaper to buy a family, but less desirable unless you had work for them all. Another fascinating detail is the role of branding and collars. Some slaves wore iron collars, inscribed with their owner's name and instructions to return them if they ran away. Imagine trying to sell a slave like that. The collar itself screamed, "This person runs away often." That lowered the value. Unless the buyer specifically wanted someone for hard labor, where escape wasn't possible. It's heartbreaking, but it's also part of the pricing system. The physical signs of resistance or punishment shaped how much someone was worth. There were also specialized markets in different cities. Rome, being the capital, had the most diverse and expensive selection. You could find everything from cheap laborers dragged in from the provinces to elite Greek tutors. But in port cities like Delos or Ostia, the markets were overflowing with captives from overseas. Delos, in particular, was infamous. Ancient writers claimed that thousands of slaves could be sold there in a single day. With so much supply, prices could plummet. Picture a chaotic scene of ships arriving. Chained groups marched off the docks, dealers shouting prices like street vendors selling fruit. It was dehumanizing on a massive scale. And yet, for the Roman buyer, it was opportunity. A merchant might stock up on cheap captives in Delos, ship them to Rome, and sell them at a markup. The journey itself became part of the value chain, just like transporting goods. Slavery was commerce, and prices reflected logistics as much as people's lives. Sometimes, though, prices skyrocketed for very unusual reasons. Exotic slaves, those from far-off lands, barely known to the Romans, could become luxury items. A dark-skinned Ethiopian slave might fetch a high price in a city where people considered them exotic and rare. Someone from a distant steppe tribe, unfamiliar to most Romans, might be bought for the novelty, like owning something unusual to show off. In those cases, the price wasn't about skill at all, but about status. Imagine a wealthy Roman boasting, "Look, my household has someone from the edges of the world," as if they were collecting artifacts instead of people. Another layer of pricing came from the possibility of manumission, the act of freeing a slave. Paradoxically, the possibility of freedom increased a slave's value. A master could promise freedom after a certain number of years of loyal service, and that gave the slave an incentive to work harder. But this also made the initial purchase more expensive. You were buying not just a worker, but someone who might one day transition into a freedman, with ties of loyalty to your household. Freed slaves often continued working for their former masters, and their children could become full Roman citizens. So in some cases, paying extra upfront was worth it in the long term. And of course, the character of the buyer shaped the price. A desperate buyer might pay more than necessary, while a shrewd negotiator could haggle for a bargain. Some Roman elites even had agents who specialized in buying slaves, men who knew the markets, knew the dealers, and knew when prices were high or low. These agents were like personal shoppers for human beings, scouting the best deals. Again, it sounds absurdly modern in a disturbing way, like the ancient version of a real estate agent, except the properties were people. The Romans themselves were fully aware of how cruel and practical this all sounded. Some writers commented on it. Seneca, the philosopher, once reminded his readers that slaves were human beings, not tools, that they laughed and cried like anyone else. But even he admitted that society didn't really treat them that way. The economy was too dependent on the system. The prices, the markets, the laws, it was all too deeply woven in. As you drift through these details, it becomes clear that the cost of a Roman slave wasn't just measured in silver coins. It was also measured in the layers of legality, reputation, origin, skill, age, and even fashion. Each factor stacked on the other, like tally marks etched into a ledger. And for every tally, there was a life, folded into an empire that treated people as commodities. So, when we ask how much Roman slaves cost, the answer is never just a number. It's a system, a culture, a marketplace that operated on supply, demand, and prejudice. Prices could rise and fall like waves, but the tide never stopped. Rome floated on that tide, sustained by an ocean of transactions, where humanity itself was the currency. If you sit quietly and picture Rome, not just as marble temples and senators in white togas, but as a humming machine powered by millions of invisible hands, then the price of those hands suddenly becomes the story of the empire itself. Every coin that clinked in a dealer's hand was connected to grain fields in Sicily, to olive groves in Spain, to silver mines in Dacia, and to households on the Palatine Hill. And those coins never stopped moving, because demand for slaves was constant. Think about the Roman household. Even a modest family might own 1 or 2 slaves, someone to help with cooking, another to help with fetching water or carrying goods. For them, the cost was heavy, maybe even a lifetime's savings. But for the wealthy, owning slaves wasn't just about work, it was about status. The more you owned, the higher you stood in society's eyes. Some wealthy Romans boasted of owning hundreds, even thousands. The emperor himself, of course, had entire armies of them: cooks, secretaries, guards, gardeners, water-bearers, chariot drivers, all paid for with a staggering outlay of silver. And this created a ladder of value. The cheapest slaves, the ones destined for the hardest labor, were like the cogs at the bottom. The most expensive, the Greek tutors and skilled artisans, were like gleaming ornaments at the top. Together, they made up a system where human prices defined the rhythm of daily life. One fascinating part of this story is how auctions themselves looked. Picture an open square, wooden platforms set up, and a dealer leading chained people onto the stage one by one. An announcer might call out their attributes, almost like an auctioneer today. 20 years old, strong arms, healthy, knows a little Greek. Bidders raised hands, calling out prices. Sometimes a slave would be displayed with a placard around their neck, listing their qualities, their skills, or warnings about bad behavior. The Romans liked transparency in these moments, not because they were kind, but because they wanted to protect the buyer's money. The sight must have been both theatrical and chilling, a stage where human value was reduced to silver. And then, once the sale was made, there was the paperwork. Roman contracts could be astonishingly detailed. They included the name of the seller, the buyer, the price, and any guarantees. Some even specified what the slave was supposed to be good at. Imagine signing a parchment that says, "This slave is guaranteed to cook, clean, and obey orders, or your money back." It sounds like satire, but those guarantees mattered in court if a dispute arose. Now, what about the financing? Not everyone had piles of coins sitting in their villa ready to be spent. Just like today, Romans had credit systems. Wealthy buyers might borrow money, or arranged to pay in installments. Dealers sometimes offered credit, knowing they could repossess the slave if the payments stopped. So yes, in a way, you could finance a human being like a piece of property. Prices weren't just raw numbers, they were tied to debts, loans, and the entire Roman banking world. There's also the darker side of resale. Slaves weren't always bought for permanent use. Some dealers were essentially flippers, buying in bulk at cheap prices from a war-torn region, then reselling them at higher prices in Rome. The journey itself increased the cost. A slave dragged across the sea might double or triple in price, not because they were any different, but because transportation added value in the eyes of Roman commerce. And while we're drifting into the details, consider the economics of training. A raw captive was cheap, but if an owner invested time in training, teaching them to read, or to cook fine meals, or to handle accounts, their value multiplied. Some owners actually trained slaves, specifically to resell them at a higher price. It was a kind of human investment portfolio. Buy low, train up, sell high. That's how some dealers made fortunes. Imagine treating a person like a stock that could appreciate in value. Now, let's step into the villa of a wealthy senator. Picture long halls, mosaic floors, and a courtyard full of plants. Behind every door is a slave with a price tag attached. The cook, perhaps bought for 6,000 denarii, the doorkeeper, maybe 1,000. The Greek tutor in the children's room, 15,000. The maid folding clothes in the corner, 800. Every person in that villa was once a number in a transaction, and the senator, sipping his wine, knew the value of each one. He might even brag about it to his friends. But prices weren't just about ability, they were also about trustworthiness. A slave with a history of running away was cheaper. A slave who had once tried to kill a master was almost unsellable, except perhaps for the mines. There was even a category for condemned slaves, criminals or rebels, who were sold cheaply and then thrown into the most brutal work imaginable. Their lives were short, their value low, but the machine still found use for them. The marketplace was full of signals, some visible, some whispered. Scars, brands, tattoos told stories of punishment or defiance. Each mark could knock down a price, but sometimes, oddly, it could raise one. A scarred gladiator might seem more fearsome, more valuable in the arena. Everything depended on context. It was a cruel, twisted arithmetic. And then there were children, sold sometimes as orphans, sometimes alongside parents. They were cheaper, but they represented potential. A Roman buyer might think, this boy will grow strong in 10 years, and pay for the future rather than the present. Children were often seen as long-term bargains, shaped from a young age into exactly what the household wanted. That meant their prices weren't static, they were wages on the future. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the hum of this economy. Coins counting out into a dealer's hand, the shuffle of chained feet, the cries of new captives who didn't even speak Latin, their words meaningless to the crowd. For Romans, this was everyday noise. For us, it feels like a nightmare. But for them, it was business as usual. And through it all, the question of cost was central. How much silver for this man, this woman, this child? How much for a cook, a tutor, a gladiator? How much for someone who might run away tomorrow, versus someone who would serve faithfully for years? These weren't just abstract prices, they were choices made in marketplaces, choices that shaped lives, choices that echoed through an empire. By now, you can see that when we ask how much Roman slaves cost, the answer stretches far beyond numbers. It stretches into contracts, auctions, reputations, training, families, scars, children, and the cold gaze of buyers measuring flesh against silver. The marketplace was a mirror of Rome itself, organized, ruthless, and unshakably dependent on turning people into property. Think for a moment about the strange irony of it all. In a society where freedom and citizenship were celebrated as the highest ideals, where Romans bragged about their republic, their laws, their rights, half the city's daily rhythm was driven by people who had none of those things. And because the Romans were so practical, they didn't leave that world of unfreedom vague. They gave it numbers, markets, contracts, and values. The price of a slave was as real and negotiable as the price of wheat or olives. If you strolled through the forum in the middle of the day, you would see senators in togas discussing politics, shopkeepers shouting out prices of fish, children darting between stalls chasing each other. And tucked among all that noise, you might stumble upon a group of chained people being led toward a platform. To the Romans, it was as ordinary as a baker selling bread. To us, it's a jolt of horror, but that's why prices mattered so much. They were the bridge between the human being and the object of trade. Now, one interesting detail about prices is how seasonal they could be. Just as food costs rose in winter or dropped during harvest, slave prices also shifted with time. After big military campaigns, there were floods of new captives, and suddenly, a strong man might be sold for half the price he fetched the year before. But in times of peace, when wars weren't feeding the markets, dealers had to stretch their supply, and buyers had to pay more. The empire's military calendar was etched into the ups and downs of human value, and this was not a small industry. At its height, scholars estimate that there may have been between 8 and 12 million slaves across the Roman world, not all at once in chains, but spread throughout farms, villas, workshops, and cities. Every one of them had once passed through a sale, a contract, or a handover. Every one of them had once had a price. Think of the sheer volume of money flowing through those markets, silver coins changing hands in a tide that never stopped. Sometimes, slaves weren't even sold one by one. They were sold in lots, entire groups bundled together, almost like wholesale. A farmer might buy 10 or 20 laborers at once for his fields. A mine operator might purchase dozens to send underground. The price per head in these cases could be lower, because the buyer was taking quantity over quality. Imagine a dealer shouting out, 100 Gauls, all strong. Take the whole lot. It sounds unthinkable, but there are records of bulk sales like this. Human beings sold by the dozen, as if they were sacks of grain. Another piece of the puzzle is specialization by region. Certain provinces were known for certain types of slaves. Sicily, with its vast estates, often sold agricultural laborers. Greece, famous for its culture, exported tutors, musicians, and philosophers. The East places like Syria offered artisans, weavers, and luxury servants. Buyers in Rome knew this. They looked for origins the way a modern shopper looks at labels. Made in Greece meant culture. Made in Gaul meant muscle. The stereotypes were crude, but they directly shaped how much silver changed hands. And then there were auctions for the elite, where slaves were dressed up, oiled, perfumed, even made to sing or demonstrate skills in front of the crowd. These were not rough bulk sales. These were spectacles designed to squeeze every last denarius out of the buyer's purse. Imagine a young Greek boy playing the lyre on stage, or a girl reciting verses, while wealthy Romans nodded approvingly and drove the bidding higher. It's unsettling, but it also tells us how entertainment and commerce blurred together in Roman life. Of course, not everyone could afford such luxuries. For many small farmers or struggling townsfolk, a slave was like a once-in-a-lifetime purchase. They might scrape together savings, sell part of their land, or take loans just to afford one pair of hands to help with work. And because it was so expensive, they often treated that one slave both as property and as a strange kind of family member. Not equal, not free, but too valuable to waste. That tension, the mix of cruelty and dependency, goes through Roman writings. At the very bottom of the scale were the condemned slaves, sometimes sold for mere scraps of silver. These were people who had rebelled, committed crimes, or simply angered the wrong person. They were destined for the mines, the galleys of ships, or the gladiatorial arena. Their lives were short, so their prices reflected that. Buying one of them was less like hiring help, and more like buying fuel. You expected it to be consumed quickly. It's grim to think about, but it shows how the market even accounted for death in its pricing. And sometimes, strangely, a price could be symbolic. Some emperors or generals gifted slaves to friends or allies, and while a value might be written down, the transaction was really about politics. Imagine receiving a slave as a gift, the same way someone today might receive a rare horse or expensive watch. It wasn't about need, it was about prestige. The value of that slave wasn't just in the coins, but in the status of the giver. The Romans themselves sometimes joked about this. Satirists wrote about men who bought fancy cooks for absurd amounts of money, only to complain that the meals weren't any better than before. Or wealthy women who spent fortunes on pretty attendants just to have them hover in the background at dinner parties. These jokes show that Romans were aware of the ridiculousness, even if they didn't question the cruelty. But let's not forget the emotional cost, though the Romans rarely admitted it. Families torn apart, children sold away, people uprooted from their homes. Those who were bought and sold carried invisible scars that no price tag could capture. And yet, In the Roman marketplace, those scars sometimes showed up as discounts. A rebellious spirit meant fewer coins on the table. In a chilling way, suffering was factored into the math, and as the coins changed hands, the city of Rome itself thrived. The baths, the aqueducts, the villas on the hills, the bustling ports, all of it relied on this trade. The price of a slave was not just a personal expense for a buyer, it was a thread in the fabric of the empire. Every denarius spent on human beings rippled outward, fueling taxes, fueling commerce, fueling wars. So when you picture a Roman holding out a silver coin to a dealer, remember that you're not just seeing a transaction between two people. You're seeing the heartbeat of an empire that measured its wealth not only in marble and gold, but in the lives it could put a price on. And as unsettling as that is, it's also strangely mesmerizing, because the more we trace the numbers, the more we see how deeply Rome tied its fate to the cost of human flesh. If you follow the trail of coins across the empire, you begin to notice that the price of a slave wasn't just about strength or skill. It was also about the ever-changing drama of Roman history itself. Wars, politics, and even fashion shaped the value of a human life. A battle in distant Gaul could send thousands of captives flooding the markets, lowering prices in Rome. A scandal in the Senate might distract buyers for a while, creating strange dips in demand. And when a new luxury trend swept the city, say, a craze for Eastern dances or exotic cooks, the price for that type of slave could skyrocket overnight. There's a story about Luke, a wealthy Roman general, who came back from campaigns in the East with a taste for luxury. He filled his house with Eastern designs, foods, and servants. Suddenly, everyone in Rome wanted the same. Eastern slaves, particularly those skilled in the kitchen, became a hot commodity. Their prices doubled, sometimes tripled, as ambitious Romans tried to copy the general's fashionable feasts. This wasn't just commerce, it was a social arms race. Having the right kind of servant became a way to display taste, refinement, even political loyalty. And yet, in the countryside, far from the glitter of Rome, the story was much simpler. A farmer didn't care about imported dancers. He wanted someone who could till the soil, harvest olives, or drive oxen. Here, the price was steadier, more tied to the rhythms of the land. A strong young man cost more during sowing season, when labor was scarce, and a bit less after harvest when the work eased. These local markets functioned almost like small stock exchanges, with prices rising and falling according to agricultural need. The Roman legal system also left its fingerprints on prices. Buyers demanded guarantees. If a slave turned out to be sick or unable to do the work promised, the buyer could return him within a set number of days. This warranty system, known as redhibitum, gave some protection to buyers and also forced sellers to be careful about how they presented their goods. Imagine the scene. A dealer insists, "This man is healthy, strong, can carry heavy loads," while the buyer squints skeptically, thinking about the legal recourse if it's a lie. The law turned human suffering into a matter of consumer rights, and the existence of that law shaped what buyers were willing to pay. And then there's the curious detail of tattoos and markings. Many slaves were branded with letters or symbols on their foreheads or arms, often to indicate ownership or prevent escape. These marks, humiliating as they were, also influenced prices. A slave with visible branding might fetch less, because he was more likely to run away, or his history suggested trouble. On the other hand, some buyers actually preferred marked slaves, since the brand showed they had already been broken in. Either way, the human body itself became part of the receipt. A walking ledger of value. One fascinating case comes from inscriptions in Pompeii, where graffiti on the walls casually lists the prices of slaves alongside things like wine and bread. You could stroll past a wall and see scratched into plaster, "For sale, 2 slaves, 6,200 sesterces." The fact that this was scribbled like advertising tells us how normal it was. People in Pompeii could glance at a wall and compare the cost of a boy with the cost of a barrel of wine. The numbers were right there in public, reducing lives to casual notes. But not all markets were open here. In Rome, there were specialized slave markets, even covered halls where buyers could examine potential purchases away from the weather. Here, the process could be disturbingly formal. Slaves were displayed naked to prevent concealment of defects, and placards hung around their necks listed their qualities, skills, and origins. It was like browsing a grim catalogue, except the catalogue breathed and trembled. The placards might say things like "Nose Greek, good with numbers, healthy," or recently captured. Buyers walked down aisles as if they were choosing fruit, stopping to prod, question, and negotiate. The whole system had rules and etiquette, turning what we would see as brutality into a polished marketplace. The Romans even developed installment payments for slaves. Not everyone could dump a pile of silver coins all at once. Some contracts allowed buyers to pay over time, like buying a cart or house. This shows how integrated slavery was into the economy. People treated it like a long-term investment, even financing it the way someone today might take out a loan. A young farmhand bought on credit was expected to earn his keep and repay his own price through labor. That chilling calculation blurred the line between human and tool in ways only Rome could normalize. And then there's the matter of age. Children were cheaper, but also riskier. They couldn't work as much, and many didn't survive long in harsh conditions. Adults in their prime fetched the best prices. But interestingly, elderly slaves still had a market. Some were sold as companions, caretakers, or even as cheap household staff. Their value might be a fraction of a younger worker, but it was still enough to keep them in circulation. The idea of retiring from slavery rarely existed. Old age simply meant a lower price tag. Sometimes the empire's hunger for slaves clashed with morality, even among Romans. Writers like Seneca hinted at the strangeness of a world where people were valued by coin. He observed that masters and slaves were both subject to fortune, that fate could reverse roles in an instant. Yet, even as he wrote about compassion, the markets kept thriving. The paradox of Roman life was that even the thinkers who questioned slavery still lived surrounded by it, and the prices in those markets told a truth the philosophy couldn't erase. Rome had built its world on numbers attached to human beings. Imagine yourself walking through one of those markets, the clatter of coins ringing out, the murmur of negotiations filling the air. You pass rows of frightened eyes, placards swinging gently on thin ropes, dealers shouting out numbers. Somewhere a boy coughs, somewhere else a woman tries to stand straighter, to look worth the price. To you it would be unbearable, but to the Romans it was Tuesday. The normalization is perhaps the most haunting part of all, because at the end of the day, the cost of a Roman slave wasn't just in silver, it was in the silence of those who accepted it. Each coin passed from hand to hand was heavy with complicity, each transaction a reminder that the empire's grandeur came at the expense of lives measured, weighed, and sold. The strangest thing about talking prices in Rome is how slippery the numbers really were. If you ask, how much did a Roman slave cost? You won't get just one answer. You'll get a range that stretches from the cost of a second-hand sandal to the price of a small villa. It depended on who you were buying, where you were buying, and when you happened to be standing in the market. A healthy farmhand from Gaul might go for a few hundred denarii, while a skilled Greek secretary could sell for 20 times that. And if the seller managed to convince the buyer that this particular boy or girl was the key to a better household or business, the number could climb into the tens of thousands. Let's imagine two scenes side by side. On one street corner, a dusty farmer hands over a pouch of coins, maybe 300 denarii, to a dealer. In return, he gets a strong-shouldered young man from Spain, someone who can plow his fields and haul his olives. The farmer leaves satisfied. He knows this worker will pay back the price in harvests within a couple of years. Meanwhile, across town, inside a wealthy senator's courtyard, a bidding war rages over a Greek slave who can write flawless Latin and calculate accounts. The price soars past 10,000 sesterces, enough to buy a modest house. The senator doesn't even blink, because for him, the slave isn't just a helper, he's a status symbol, proof that the household runs with cultured efficiency. Both men walk away convinced they got a fair deal, though the gap between their purchases is staggering. These kinds of contrasts were everywhere in Rome. The city was a giant mixing bowl of wealth and poverty, and the slave markets reflected that. The same streets where senators strutted in embroidered togas were lined with stalls selling fish, onions, and bread, and in between, human lives were bargained over, some treated like cattle, others like luxury goods. The range of prices tells us just how versatile slavery was in Roman society. It could be cheap labor, or it could be a glittering investment, depending on who was buying. One fascinating wrinkle is that sometimes the state itself set prices. After massive wars, the Roman treasury sold off captives in bulk, almost like government auctions. These sales could be shockingly low. Captured prisoners of war, exhausted and wounded, might be sold for a few coins each, because the government simply wanted to move them quickly. Private dealers then scooped them up, hoping to resell at higher prices later. In a way, it was like flipping houses, except the houses could cry, resist, or die before turning a profit. It shows how deeply the logic of commerce seeped into the business of empire. Now, if you were a buyer, you had to be savvy. Sellers often exaggerated, claiming a slave could speak languages he barely knew, or work skills she didn't actually have. Buyers might bring along friends who could test the claims. A teacher would test a Greek boy by asking him to recite poetry. A farmer might check a man's calloused hands to see if he had really worked the land. These inspections mattered because mistakes were expensive. Spending thousands of sesterces on someone who turned out to be sick or lazy could ruin your finances. That's why the warranty laws existed. But even with those, shrewdness was key. Imagine being a slave caught in this process. You stand on a platform, a placard hanging around your neck. Strangers walk up, lift your arms, peer into your mouth, ask questions you can't refuse. Your future shrinks to a number whispered between two men, and you know that number will decide whether you are sent to a farm, a kitchen, or a library. In that moment, your entire existence is reduced to value in silver. It's horrifying, and yet for Romans it was routine. The actual numbers are worth lingering on. Sources mention ordinary slaves costing around 500 to 2,000 sesterces, depending on age and health. Skilled ones could jump to 10,000 or more. Exceptional cases, famous actors, doctors, or scribes might soar into the 50,000 range. To put that in perspective, a Roman legionary's yearly wage was about 900 sesterces, so owning a skilled slave could be like spending 50 years' salary in one purchase. That's how wildly expensive and elite some of these transactions were. For the wealthy, though, it was worth it, because a clever secretary could manage estates, track rents, or tutor children in ways that multiplied wealth down the line. Prices also exposed the cruel logic of supply and demand. After Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, so many captives flooded Italy that prices collapsed. One writer claimed slaves were being sold as cheap as cattle, with whole groups sold for a handful of coins. Compare that to times of peace, when supplies dried up and costs rose. It's a grim reminder that human lives were tied directly to Rome's hunger for conquest. Every victory meant cheaper slaves. Every peace treaty meant higher prices. War itself became part of the marketplace. The differences in gender also shaped cost. Male slaves were often more expensive for heavy labor or skilled work, but young women could fetch very high prices if they were considered attractive or suited for domestic service. Sadly, exploitation was baked into the system, and many buyers viewed beauty itself as a commodity. A girl who might have been valued as a singer or companion could end up with a price tag larger than that of a farmhand, twice her size. This imbalance highlights how much Roman ideas of value were colored by desire as much as utility. But perhaps the most shocking detail is that even gladiators had their price. Trainers purchased them from markets, sometimes for staggering sums, depending on potential. A strong Thracian youth might cost thousands, but if he survived the arena, the investment could pay off in fame and prize money. Gladiators were human beings turned into financial bets. The higher the risk, the higher the potential reward. The same logic applied to slaves. In mines, dangerous work meant low prices, because most would die quickly. Buying a miner wasn't about long-term service. It was about squeezing out as much labor as possible before the inevitable end. It all circles back to the unsettling fact that the Roman Empire functioned as though every person had a barcode. Their entire economy wove humans into its balance sheets. When we read about aqueducts, roads, and villas, it's easy to forget the background trade that made all that possible. But each stone carried to build those wonders was lifted by hands that had once been priced in a market. Each loaf of bread baked in a Roman oven depended on someone whose body had once been tagged with a value. The empire was soaked through with this invisible arithmetic of lives, and what's chilling is how normal it seemed to them. For us, the numbers sound grotesque, the idea unbearable. For them, it was simply business, like haggling over grain or pottery. If you could afford it, you bought. If you couldn't, you dreamed of saving up one day. And the slaves themselves had no say. Their worth was decided without their voices, their futures locked into coins exchanged between strangers. That silence, more than anything, is the echo that lingers. When we try to picture the Roman world, if you pause and let your mind wander through the marketplaces of Rome, it's easy to see that price wasn't just about muscle or skill. It was about perception. A Greek slave might command higher value because of the assumption he was cultured, literate, or artistic. A young Gaul, broad-shouldered and fierce-looking, might be prized for farming or military labor, and a Syrian artisan, perfect for weaving fine cloth or crafting intricate items for wealthy households. Each origin carried a reputation that influenced how much silver would be exchanged. The Romans were obsessed with appearances, and that included their slaves. If a person looked healthy, well-fed and obedient, buyers were willing to pay more. A haggard or scarred slave, cheaper. The body itself became a billboard advertising worth. You could tell the story of someone's life just by the state of their muscles, their skin, their posture, and the market translated all of that into coins. Let's think about numbers again, but this time in a broader context. Ordinary laborers, farmers, and household helpers might go for 500 to 2,000 sesterces, as we've mentioned. Tutors, accountants, and literate scribes could be 10 times that, 10,000 sesterces or more. Exceptional cases, the people who could manage an entire estate, heal the sick, or entertain the elite, might soar to 50,000 sesterces. To give perspective, a centurion earned roughly 1,500 sesterces a year, so a single elite slave could cost decades of a soldier's wages. That's staggering. Now imagine the auctions. Dealers would lead slaves onto platforms, sometimes in chains, sometimes standing proud, placards declaring skills and origins swinging from their necks. Buyers scrutinized every detail. Could he carry a heavy load? Did she know Greek? Was he obedient? The process was both spectacle and transaction. Sometimes the auction would last hours, with bids rising and falling, until finally the hammer came down, or the Roman equivalent of a nod, and the price was fixed. It's worth noting that prices fluctuated dramatically with supply and demand. After major wars, like Caesar's campaigns in Gaul or Pompey's in the East, thousands of captives flooded the markets. Prices plummeted. Suddenly, a strong young man could be bought for a few hundred coins instead of 1,000. But during long stretches of peace, when supply was limited, prices climbed. You can almost track the history of Rome through these numbers. Each spike and dip, echoing conquests and lulls. Children, sadly, were also part of this system. Young boys and girls were cheaper because they were untrained, but they represented potential. Owners could shape them into specific roles: farmhands, tutors, house servants, and their value could rise as they matured. Families were sometimes split apart, with parents sold separately from children. That too affected pricing. A family unit might cost less per person, but was less desirable for buyers who didn't want extra baggage. Gender also played a critical role. Men were often more expensive for labor-intensive work or skilled tasks, but women could be priced highly for domestic work or perceived beauty. This imbalance reflects the cruel logic of Roman society, where exploitation and utility intertwined in determining value. A young, skilled, or attractive woman could fetch more than a man twice her size, depending on the buyer's desire. And then there were gladiators. Young men trained for the arena were a different kind of commodity. A Thracian youth might be bought for thousands of sesterces, trained rigorously, and then risked in the sand of the Colosseum. If successful, he could bring fame and fortune to his owner, increasing his value further. Gladiators were human beings treated as both athletes and investments. Risk dictated price, and survival enhanced it. One cannot forget the legal aspects. The Red Hibitoria Act, which allowed buyers to return a slave if they were defective, shows how formalized the market was. Sellers were forced to disclose defects, past illnesses, or rebellious behavior. Contracts could include everything from guarantees of obedience to health certifications. The law turned slavery into a highly structured economic system. There was even financing for slaves. Not everyone could pay up front, so buyers sometimes purchased on credit or in installments. The idea was that the labor of the slave would cover the cost over time. It's chilling to realize that someone's life was considered a long-term investment, in the same way someone might finance a piece of land or a cart. And in large cities like Rome, specialized dealers and agents made the market more sophisticated. Some buyers employed agents who scouted for the best slaves, assessed value, and negotiated prices. These agents knew exactly how to exploit the fluctuations of supply, the trends of origin, and even fashion to maximize profit. Slavery was big business. It was not only morally grotesque, but also economically intricate. Even the tiniest details mattered. A visible scar could reduce price, while good health, strong physique, or desirable skills could inflate it. In some cases, exotic origin alone could spike prices. A slave from distant lands might be bought not for work but for prestige. Owning a rare or unusual slave was a statement. I am wealthy, cultured, connected. Social value could eclipse practical utility. The markets were terrifyingly normalized. Plaster graffiti in Pompeii lists prices alongside everyday items like wine and bread. Dealers flaunted placards. Slaves were displayed, inspected, prodded, and sold as if this were routine shopping. Families tore apart, children auctioned off, and yet life went on with a bizarre casualness. For Romans, this was ordinary. For us, it is almost unimaginable. By the end of all this, one thing is clear: the price of a Roman slave was more than just coins. It was about skills, origin, age, gender, health, potential, legal guarantees, social perception, and the ever-changing tides of history. Every number we read tells a story of human lives measured, weighed, and exchanged as currency. And each transaction, no matter how calculated, rippled through the empire, fueling wealth, power, and infrastructure, built on the backs of people who could never consent. As you continue to imagine the streets and marketplaces of ancient Rome, it becomes clear that slavery was not just about labor. It was deeply entwined with identity, social hierarchy, and even human psychology. The price of a slave told you who could afford luxury, who could command power, and who was forced to navigate life with limited choices. The numbers themselves were intertwined with Roman values and assumptions about obedience, strength, and skill. Consider the typical household. A moderately wealthy family might own 2 or 3 slaves. That could include a cook, a cleaner, and maybe a tutor for the children. Each would have a price reflective not only of their ability to perform tasks, but also of their expected reliability. Meanwhile, the aristocrats who owned hundreds had to think strategically, like managing a complex workforce. For them, buying a slave was part of estate planning. Some purchased young people as long-term investments, knowing they would become skilled in specific tasks over time. Others bought older, experienced laborers for immediate work. Interestingly, some buyers were willing to pay extra for cultural skills. Greek slaves, for instance, were prized not only for literacy, but also for refinement. They could teach children read aloud during dinners, or provide artistic guidance. This elevated status translated directly into higher prices. In essence, education and refinement were commodities just as tangible as muscle or obedience. Imagine negotiating for a slave who could recite poetry, cook a complex meal, and run accounts accurately. The value was enormous. Supply and demand dictated fluctuations. After military campaigns, thousands of captives from Gaul, Britannia, or the East arrived on Italian shores. The market was flooded, driving down prices. Dealers had to compete for buyers, often offering guarantees or incentives to move their inventory. Conversely, during long periods of peace, the shortage of new captives drove prices up. It was a system as fluid and merciless as the Mediterranean tide. Auctions themselves were elaborate. Slaves were displayed naked or lightly clothed to reveal any flaws, scars, or injuries. Dealers proudly proclaimed attributes: age, health, strength, skills, and even personality traits. Buyers tested claims, asking questions, or giving small tasks. Some auctions were theatrical, with slaves performing basic duties to demonstrate value. Others were more transactional, a quick exchange of coins and chains. The spectacle could be disturbing to outsiders, but to Romans it was ordinary commerce. Children and teenagers had their own pricing logic. Young boys and girls were often cheaper because their labor potential was still unproven, but they were also highly adaptable. Buyers could train them, shaping their skills to fit household needs. In some cases, children were sold in family units, though the separation of relatives was common. Depending on demand, a family could be priced lower per person than individual slaves, but buyers often preferred to select the strongest or most skilled among the group. Gender played a crucial role. Men were more likely to be purchased for labor, combat, or skilled work, while women were often valued for domestic service, caretaking, and, tragically, sexual exploitation. This dynamic made young women highly sought after in certain contexts, driving their prices above those of men of similar age and strength. Gender, combined with age, origin, and skill, created a complex matrix for calculating worth. Gladiators were another specialized market. Young men purchased for training in the arena could cost thousands of cents. Their value was based not only on physical prowess but also potential fame and winnings. Gladiators were investments in spectacle, where risk was part of the calculation. Miners, by contrast, were low-value purchases, because their lives were expected to be short due to brutal working conditions. The market recognized mortality as a factor in pricing. Another grim indicator of how deeply dehumanized this system was. The law also influenced cost. Buyers were protected by contracts that required full disclosure of defects or illness. If a slave was faulty, a return or refund could be demanded. This legal structure meant that sellers had to consider honesty or at least careful presentation because deception could be costly. Warranties, guarantees, and inspections all became part of the price calculation. Even the smallest details mattered. A scar, a limp, or a minor defect could lower the price. Conversely, strong musculature, clear skin, and skill sets could increase it. Exotic origins also played a role. A person from distant lands, unfamiliar to most Romans, might be highly prized for their rarity. Prestige often outweighed practical utility in such cases. Owning an exotic slave signaled wealth, cultural knowledge, and social standing. Financing was another factor. Not all buyers had the funds to purchase outright, so some transactions involved credit or installment plans. In these cases, the buyer would pay gradually, expecting the labor of the slave to offset costs. This system essentially treated the human being as an asset capable of generating revenue over time. It blurred the line between personhood and property in ways that modern observers find profoundly disturbing. And so, the market for slaves was vast and multiple. Every transaction involved consideration of age, gender, origin, skills, health, personality, legal protections, and future potential. Each number represented a life, but in Roman society, it was primarily viewed as currency. The market itself reflected and reinforced the empire's values, where status, power, and economic calculation dictated the fate of millions. Ultimately, the cost of a Roman slave was not static. It ebbed and flowed with war, peace, fashion, political change, and social preference. The numbers might seem abstract, but behind them were countless human stories, each one weighed, measured, and traded. And for every coin exchanged, the empire grew, expanded, and flourished on the backs of lives whose worth was set by market forces, not by freedom or choice. As we drift deeper into the marketplace, the complexity of Roman slavery becomes ever clearer. It wasn't just about buying muscle or labor, it was about strategy, planning, and empire-wide economics. A wealthy Roman didn't merely think, "I need someone to clean the floors." They thought in terms of profit, influence, and social status. Every coin spent on a slave had implications beyond immediate labor. It affected household efficiency, social perception, and even political leverage. Consider a large estate in Sicily or Campania. The landowner might need dozens of laborers for the olive harvest, vineyards, and fields. Prices were determined by age, strength, and stamina. A young man in his prime could demand a higher price because he would work longer and endure more physical strain. But an older, experienced worker might also command a premium for reliability and skill. Even within these seemingly simple transactions, Roman buyers were calculating long-term value. Then there were skilled tradespeople. Artisans, scribes, and tutors could fetch far higher sums. A skilled Greek tutor who could teach children Latin and Greek might cost several thousand sesterces. An artisan capable of weaving fine fabrics or carving intricate marble could demand an even higher price. For the wealthy, these purchases were investments. A well-trained slave could manage estates, educate children, or produce luxury goods that increased household wealth. Auctions were fascinatingly theatrical. Slaves were often displayed on platforms with placards detailing age, origin, skills, and health. Buyers walked through, scrutinizing every feature, asking questions, even testing physical strength or intellectual abilities. In some cases, slaves demonstrated their talents reciting poetry, cooking, or performing basic tasks. The spectacle was designed to extract maximum value. For the Romans, it was ordinary commerce. For modern eyes, it is almost surreal. Children had a different kind of market logic. Boys and girls were cheaper due to their inexperience, but they represented potential. Owners could train them to fit very specific roles, shaping behavior and skills from a young age. Family units were sometimes sold together, though often separated. The market always favored selection, with buyers picking the strongest, smartest, or most skilled members of a group. That flexibility made children both risky and lucrative investments. Gender dynamics further shaped pricing. Men were often preferred for labor-intensive or skilled work, while women were often valued for domestic service or appearance. A young woman with domestic or personal skills could fetch prices higher than a man twice her size. Wealthy buyers factored in everything from utility to social prestige. When deciding how much to pay, gladiators were another specialized category. They could cost thousands of sesterces, depending on potential, skill, and strength. Owners treated them as both athletes and financial assets, their value tied to survival and performance. Mines, on the other hand, were populated by low-cost slaves expected to work until death. Mortality influenced pricing. High risk meant low purchase cost. The empire's cruel logic was embedded in every coin. Legal protections also influenced value. Contracts guaranteed obedience, health, and sometimes even skill. If a slave proved effective, buyers could demand restitution. This forced sellers to present slaves carefully and honestly, or at least cleverly. Law, finance, and commerce intertwined in a system designed to reduce uncertainty in human transactions. Exotic origin was another factor. A rare slave from a distant province could command high prices, even if practical utility was secondary. Prestige drove markets. Owning a rare, cultured, or beautiful person signaled wealth, taste, and power. Social status could trump productivity, creating bizarre price differentials. Credit systems allowed wider participation in the market. Buyers could pay in installments, expecting the slave to produce labor or value sufficient to repay the debt. This blurred the line between human life and property, turning a person into a long-term investment vehicle. The Romans' economic ingenuity, though morally horrifying, was incredibly detailed. Even the smallest factors mattered. Age, gender, health, origin, skill, and perceived obedience all shaped pricing. Scars, blemishes, or past injuries reduced value. Extraordinary strength or intelligence increased it. Markets for slaves were volatile, sensitive to changes in supply, political shifts, and fashion trends. A victory in war could flood the market, dropping prices. Peace could shrink supply, raising them again. Ultimately, the price of a Roman slave was a barometer of society. It reflected wealth, distribution, military campaigns, social trends, and human perception. Each transaction was a thread in the empire's fabric. While numbers give us a glimpse, they obscure the human suffering behind them. Every coin spent echoes with lives reduced to currency, families torn apart, and futures dictated by markets. Even so, Romans normalized it. Graffiti in Pompeii lists prices alongside everyday items, showing how ordinary it was. Slaves were inspected, displayed, sold. Families torn apart, children auctioned, adults measured and priced. To Romans, this was everyday life. To us, it is a haunting reflection of human ingenuity used to commodify humanity. By now, it's clear that asking how much did a Roman slave cost is almost meaningless without context. The number itself was fluid, influenced by supply, demand, skill, gender, age, and status. Behind each coin is a story of calculation, ambition, and cruelty. The marketplace was both a mirror of the empire and a machine sustaining it. Silver exchanged hands, lives were bought and sold, and the empire thrived on the labor of those whose voices could not be heard. If you wander through the Roman marketplaces in your mind, one detail becomes painfully clear. Every coin, every transaction, carried a story of human lives tightly bound to commerce. Prices were never abstract numbers. They reflected labor potential, social value, origin, health, age, skill, and sometimes even beauty. A slave's worth was measured against a complex matrix that combined practicality and prestige. For example, the urban household in Rome. A moderately wealthy family might purchase a cook, a cleaner, and a personal attendant. Each slave had a different price, based not only on capability, but also on expected loyalty and adaptability. For the elite, the stakes were higher. A Greek tutor might cost 10 times more than a farmhand because he could teach children, read for the family, and manage financial accounts. Skills, culture, and perceived intelligence could translate directly into thousands of sesterces. Supply and demand played a central role. After wars, particularly those in Gaul, the East, or Britannia, the market was flooded with captives. Prices collapsed. Ordinary men and women could be bought cheaply in bulk, as dealers tried to move vast numbers quickly. Conversely, in times of peace or after long gaps between campaigns, supply dwindled and prices rose. Even fashion trends influenced value. Eastern entertainers or exotic servants could fetch double or triple the normal price if they became fashionable among the elite. Auctions were formal and often theatrical. Slaves were displayed on raised platforms, sometimes in chains, sometimes lightly clothed, to reveal their condition. Placards hung around their necks, detailing age, origin, health, skills, and sometimes personality traits. Buyers scrutinized every detail, asking questions, testing abilities, or observing behavior. In some cases, slaves demonstrated skills, reciting poetry, cooking, or performing tasks to impress buyers. These events were as much social spectacles as commercial exchanges. Children were an investment. Boys and girls were cheaper due to inexperience, but they offered flexibility. A boy could be trained as a farmhand, a soldier, or a scribe. A girl as a domestic servant or attendant. Family units were sometimes sold together, though separation was common. Buyers often selected the strongest, most promising individuals, understanding that potential mattered as much as current capability. Gender was a determining factor. Men were usually preferred for labor-intensive or skilled work. Women often commanded high prices for domestic service or, tragically, attractiveness. Wealthy buyers paid a premium for perceived beauty, obedience, or specific skills. This cruel calculus demonstrates how Roman markets intertwined utility, desire, and social status in determining value. Gladiators were a different category. Young men, trained for the arena, could cost thousands of Owners treated them as both athletes and investments, with value tied to potential fame and winnings. Mines, on the other hand, were low-value markets. Mortality was expected, so the initial price was low. The market factored in risk and lifespan, revealing a deeply pragmatic, if morally unsettling, economic logic. Legal frameworks shaped pricing as well. Contracts offered warranties on obedience, health, and sometimes skill. If a slave failed to meet expectations, buyers could demand restitution. Sellers were compelled to present slaves carefully, and buyers were expected to verify claims. Law, commerce, and human lives intertwined, creating a system both highly structured and profoundly dehumanizing. Exotic origins commanded higher prices. A rare slave from a distant province might be purchased more for prestige than utility. Wealthy Romans flaunted such individuals as status symbols, signaling wealth, taste, and influence. The combination of rarity, skill, and beauty drove extraordinary price disparities. Financing was common. Buyers who couldn't pay up front could purchase on credit, expecting the labor of the slave to offset costs over time. This system effectively treated human beings as long-term investments, blurring the line between property and person. Even small details mattered. Age, gender, health, markings, and skills influenced final pricing. Scarred or injured individuals were cheaper. Strong, intelligent, or attractive, slaves were more expensive. The volatility of the market was striking. Conquests, peace treaties, famines, and fashion trends all affected supply and demand. A military victory could flood markets, dropping prices. Peace could create shortages, driving them up. Each fluctuation reflected the empire's broader political and economic rhythms. The market for slaves mirrored the empire itself, fluid, hierarchical, and ruthless. Graffiti in Pompeii reminds us how normalized this was. Prices were listed alongside everyday items like bread or wine. Dealers displayed slaves openly, inspected them publicly, and conducted transactions that tore families apart. For Romans, this was ordinary. For us, it is a haunting reflection of normalized dehumanization. Ultimately, asking how much did a Roman slave cost opens a window into the empire's structure. Numbers alone cannot convey the layers of calculation, ambition, and cruelty embedded in each transaction. Every coin spent carried the weight of a life, shaped the empire, and reinforced societal hierarchies. The market was a mirror of Rome's wealth, power, and morality or lack thereof, showing a civilization where human lives were simultaneously indispensable and disposable. If we let ourselves drift into the quieter corners of Roman life, the economic logic of slavery becomes even more complex. Prices were never just numbers, they were expressions of supply, demand, and the subtle nuances of Roman society. Buying a slave was a statement, a gamble, and a social maneuver all at once. The coin exchanged hands, but the value was calculated across multiple dimensions: strength, skill, gender, age, origin, obedience, and even aesthetic appeal. Imagine a villa in the Italian countryside. The landowner needs laborers for harvest season, carpenters to repair structures, and cooks for the household. Each worker's price reflects not just the work they can do, but the reliability and endurance they bring. A young man in his prime is ideal for field labor, while an experienced older worker might be indispensable for delicate construction or specialized crafts. Even within a single transaction, the buyer is balancing cost, productivity, and risk. Skilled slaves commanded even higher prices. Tutors, accountants, and Greek or Syrian artisans were highly valued. A Greek tutor who could educate children in Greek and Latin, read poetry, or maintain household records might cost thousands of sequins. For the wealthy, these purchases were long-term investments. A well-trained slave could increase the efficiency, culture, and wealth of an entire household. The same was true for artisans, whose work could be sold for profit or used to enhance the home's prestige. Auctions were a mix of spectacle and scrutiny. Slaves were displayed on raised platforms, sometimes in chains, sometimes lightly clothed, to reveal physical condition. Placards detailed age, origin, health, skills, and sometimes even temperament. Buyers asked questions, tested strength, and sometimes requested demonstrations of ability. In some cases, slaves performed tasks to impress potential buyers, reciting poetry, cooking, or showing manual skills. The entire system was designed to extract maximum value from each sale. Children were valued differently. Young boys and girls were cheaper due to inexperience, but their potential made them attractive. A boy could be trained for labor, education, or military service. A girl for domestic work or household duties. Family units were occasionally sold together, though often separated. Buyers often selected the most promising individuals, understanding that potential could significantly increase long-term value. Gender dynamics shaped pricing sharply. Men were more likely purchased for heavy labor or skilled work, while women could fetch higher prices for domestic duties, personal service, or attractiveness. The same size or strength didn't guarantee the same price. Social and aesthetic considerations could outweigh physical utility. The system reflects the unsettling reality of a society where exploitation and utility were deeply intertwined. Gladiators formed a specialized higher-risk, higher-reward market. Young men purchased for the arena could cost thousands of cents. Owners viewed them as both athletes and investments. Success in combat increased their value. Injury or death decreased it. Mines, by contrast, were populated by low-cost slaves with short expected lifespans. Here, mortality and danger were factored directly into the purchase price. Risk and potential return were calculated brutally and pragmatically. Legal protections influenced transactions as well. Contracts guaranteed obedience, health, and sometimes skills. Buyers could demand restitution for defective or ill slaves. Sellers had to present slaves carefully, highlighting strengths and downplaying defects. Law, finance, and human life intertwined in a system, highly structured yet profoundly dehumanizing. Exotic origin was another factor driving price. Slaves from distant provinces, rare in Rome, could fetch high prices for prestige alone. Ownership of such individuals signaled wealth, taste, and social standing, even if practical utility was secondary. This reflects how luxury, status, and economy intersected in Roman slave markets. Credit systems extended the market. Buyers who could not pay up front sometimes purchased slaves on installments, expecting the labor to offset debt over time. This system effectively treated human beings as long-term assets, further blurring the line between property and person. Every detail, gender, health, markings, skill affected price. Even minor defects reduced value. Strength, intelligence, and attractiveness increased it. Market volatility was constant. Wars, peace treaties, famines, and fashion trends influenced supply and demand. Conquest could flood markets and reduce prices. Peace could create scarcity and drive them higher. Fashion trends could make Eastern entertainers or exotic slaves highly desirable, inflating prices disproportionately. Every fluctuation reflected the broader political and economic pulse of the empire. Graffiti in Pompeii, listing slave prices alongside everyday items, shows how normalized these transactions were. Dealers openly displayed, inspected, and sold slaves. Families were torn apart, children auctioned, adults measured and valued like objects. For Romans, this was ordinary. For us, it is a haunting reminder of how deeply entrenched slavery was in every aspect of life. Ultimately, the question, how much did a Roman slave cost, is almost meaningless without context. Price alone cannot convey the complex calculations, ambitions, and brutal realities behind each transaction. Every coin carried a life, influenced the empire, and reinforced societal hierarchies. The marketplace mirrored Rome itself, a civilization thriving on labor, wealth, and exploitation, where human lives were both indispensable and disposable. If we take a deeper look at the numbers themselves, the range is staggering. Ordinary slaves, farmhands, cleaners, basic laborers might cost between 500 and 2,000 sesterces, depending on age, strength, and health. Skilled slaves, tutors, accountants, artisans could easily reach 10,000 sesterces or more. Exceptional individuals, such as experienced administrators, doctors, or entertainers, might fetch up to 50,000 sesterces. To put this in perspective, a Roman legionary earned roughly 900 sesterces a year. Buying a top-tier slave could equate 2 decades of a soldier's wages. The fluctuation of prices was influenced by more than just skill or utility. Wars, particularly in Gaul, the East, and Britannia, could flood markets with captives, reducing costs. Peace periods or scarcity could raise them. Fashion trends among the elite also affected value. A rare foreign dancer or musician could become a highly prized commodity. Supply, demand, status, and taste all intertwined to shape the market. Auctions were central to this economy. Slaves were displayed on raised platforms, sometimes in chains or lightly clothed to show health and physical condition. Placards detailed age, origin, abilities, and temperament. Buyers inspected closely, asking questions, testing strength, and sometimes requesting demonstrations. Slaves could recite poetry, cook, or show specific skills to impress buyers. The process combined commerce with performance, turning human beings into the centerpiece of a calculated display. Children were an important part of the market, often purchased for their potential rather than immediate labor. Boys could be trained for farming, military service, or domestic duties, while girls were molded into domestic workers or attendants. Families were occasionally sold together, though separations were common. Buyers selected the most promising children to ensure a higher return on investment. Gender was a major determinant of value. Men were sought for heavy labor or skilled work, while women could fetch high prices for domestic service or appearance. Beauty, obedience, and perceived refinement influenced cost. The cruel arithmetic of the Roman market often placed women in disproportionately high-value categories due to societal expectations. Gladiators formed a specialized high-stakes market. Young men trained for combat in arenas could cost thousands of sesterces. Owners saw them as both athletes and investments, with value tied to potential performance and survival. Minors, conversely, were cheap because high mortality was expected. Price reflected the harsh pragmatism of Roman economics, measuring risk and anticipated lifespan. Legal protections affected transactions as well. Contracts guaranteed obedience, health, and sometimes skill. Defective or ill slaves could be returned. Sellers were compelled to present slaves carefully, balancing honesty with persuasion. Law, finance, and morality intertwined in a system that was highly structured yet profoundly dehumanizing. Exotic origin was another pricing factor. Slaves from distant provinces were rarer and highly prized. Ownership signaled wealth, cultural sophistication, and social status. Prestige often trumped practical utility, creating dramatic disparities in pricing. A rare slave could be worth many times more than a stronger or more experienced individual, simply because of origin. Credit and financing further complicated the market. Buyers unable to pay up front could purchase on installment, expecting the slave's labor to offset costs. This system treated human beings as long-term investments, commodifying life in ways that are hard to imagine today. Every detailage, gender, health, skill, markings, affected value. Minor defects reduced price. Exceptional abilities or appearance increased it. Market volatility was constant. Conquests, peace treaties, political events, and fashion trends shifted supply and demand. Victory in war could flood markets, dropping prices. Peace or scarcity could drive them higher. Fashion could make Eastern entertainers or exotic slaves highly desirable, inflating prices. The market mirrored the empire's political and social rhythms. Graffiti in Pompeii illustrates normalization. Slave prices appeared alongside everyday items like bread or wine. Dealers displayed, inspected, and sold slaves publicly. Families were torn apart, children auctioned, adults evaluated like objects. For Romans, this was normal. For modern observers, it is a haunting testament to the casual dehumanization that underpinned the empire. In the end, the question, how much did a Roman slave cost, reveals more about the empire than a simple price tag ever could. Each number represents calculation, ambition, and cruelty. Coins changed hands while lives were reduced to labor potential, prestige, and profit. The marketplace reflected and reinforced the social hierarchy, fueling the economy, supporting infrastructure, and maintaining the empire's grandeur at the expense of human freedom. If we let our minds wander through the streets and marketplaces of Rome, one fact becomes unavoidable. Slavery was deeply woven into every aspect of life. Prices were more than numbers, they were reflections of Roman society, supply and demand, and the cruel arithmetic of human value. Every purchase, every coin, represented a life measured, assessed, and exchanged. Ordinary laborers, such as farmhands or household servants, might cost between 500 and 2,000 sesterces, depending on age, health, and strength. Skilled slaves, like tutors, scribes, or artisans, could fetch 10,000 sesterces or more. Exceptional individuals, administrators, doctors, entertainers might sell for as much as 50,000 sesterces. Considering that a legionary earned roughly 900 sesterces a year, the numbers are staggering. Some purchases equaled decades of wages, a massive investment by any standard. The market fluctuated constantly. After wars, such as Caesar's campaigns in Gaul or Pompey's in the East, captives flooded the Italian markets, driving prices down. Peace periods or scarcity could raise prices. Fashion trends also influenced value. An exotic dancer or rare foreign artisan could command far more than a local laborer. Supply, demand, skill, appearance, and status intertwined to shape the final price. Auctions were both practical and theatrical. Slaves were displayed on raised platforms, sometimes lightly clothed, to reveal physical condition. Placards described age, origin, skills, health, and temperament. Buyers examined them closely, asking questions and testing abilities. Some demonstrations included reciting poetry, cooking, or performing manual tasks. The market blended commerce with performance, turning humans into objects of calculation and spectacle. Children were often purchased for potential rather than immediate work. Boys could be trained for labor, military service, or domestic duties. Girls for household work or personal service. Family units were sometimes sold together, though separation was common. Buyers selected promising individuals, understanding that potential increased long-term value. Gender played a key role in pricing. Men were generally purchased for physical labor or skilled work. Women were often bought for domestic service or attractiveness. The interplay of utility and aesthetic appeal drove prices. A young woman might be worth more than a man of similar size or strength simply because of social and cultural perceptions. The Roman market was brutally pragmatic and socially informed at the same time. Gladiators formed a unique market segment. Young men trained for combat could cost thousands of sesterces. Their value depended on potential performance, fame, and survivability. Mines, by contrast, required cheap labor with short life expectancy. Risk was directly calculated into price, reflecting the harsh pragmatism of the Roman economy. Legal protections also influenced cost. Contracts guaranteed obedience, health, and sometimes skill. Defective or ill slaves could be returned. Sellers had to carefully present individuals, balancing honesty with persuasion. Law, commerce, and human life were entangled in a highly structured yet morally troubling system. Exotic origin further increased value. Slaves from distant provinces were rarer and highly prized. Ownership signaled wealth, sophistication, and social status. In many cases, prestige outweighed practical utility, creating enormous disparities in price. A rare slave could be worth far more than a stronger, more skilled local individual. Financing widened the market. Buyers who could not pay up front could purchase slaves on credit, expecting labor to offset costs over time. This system effectively treated human beings as long-term assets. Age, gender, health, markings, and skills all affected price. Even minor defects lowered value. Exceptional abilities or appearance increased it. Market volatility was constant. Conquests, peace treaties, famines, and social trends influenced supply and demand. Victory could flood the market and reduce prices. Peace and scarcity could drive them higher. Fashionable foreign entertainers or exotic slaves could dramatically inflate value. The market mirrored Rome itself, hierarchical, fluid, and calculated. Graffiti in Pompeii illustrates normalization. Slave prices were listed alongside bread and wine. Dealers displayed, inspected, and sold individuals publicly. Families were torn apart. Children auctioned, adults scrutinized. For Romans, this was routine. For modern observers, it is a haunting testament to normalized dehumanization. Ultimately, the question "how much did a Roman slave cost?" opens a window into the empire itself. Numbers alone cannot convey the calculations, ambitions, and harsh realities behind each transaction. Every coin carried a life, shaped the empire, and reinforced social hierarchy. The marketplace reflected the values of Rome, thriving on labor, wealth, and exploitation while reducing human beings to assets. As we wandered deeper into the economy of Rome, one thing becomes unavoidable. The pricing of slaves was both an art and a science, a brutal reflection of how human life was valued in a society built on labor and conquest. Prices were determined not just by physical ability, but by age, gender, health, skills, origin, and even appearance. Each transaction was a calculation of risk, utility, and social prestige, and the numbers tell us as much about the buyers as they do about the slaves themselves. Ordinary slaves, domestic workers, or laborers might cost anywhere from 500 to those 1000 sesterces, depending on strength and health. Skilled workers, artisans, tutors, accountants could easily reach 10,000 sesterces. Exceptional cases, such as administrators, doctors, or performers, could fetch up to 50,000 sesterces. When you consider that a legionary earned roughly 900 sesterces annually, the scale is astonishing. A single elite slave could cost decades of a soldier's wages, a massive investment that few but the wealthy could afford. Market conditions were unpredictable. Wars, especially Caesar's campaigns in Gaul or Pompey's conquests in the east, could flood the market with captives, lowering prices. Peace or scarcity drove them higher. Social trends and fashion influenced demand. An exotic entertainer or rare foreign artisan might command far more than a local laborer, illustrating the intricate interplay of supply, demand, and social prestige in the Roman economy. Auctions were both transactional and performative. Slaves were displayed on raised platforms, sometimes in chains, sometimes lightly clothed to show physical condition. Placards detailed age, origin, skills, health, and temperament. Buyers scrutinized every feature, tested strength, asked questions, and sometimes requested demonstrations. Slaves might recite poetry, cook, or perform tasks to impress buyers. The spectacle was designed to extract maximum value, turning human beings into calculated commodities. Children were sold for potential, not immediate labor. Boys could be trained for farming, military service, or domestic work. Girls for household duties or personal service. Families were occasionally sold together, though separation was common. Buyers often selected the most promising individuals to maximize return on investment. Gender influenced pricing significantly. Men were generally purchased for labor or skilled work. Women for domestic service, appearance, or other social factors. Beauty, obedience, and perceived refinement could dramatically increase a woman's value. This reflects how the Roman market intertwined practicality with social and aesthetic considerations. Gladiators formed a unique, high-risk market. Young men trained for combat could cost thousands of slaves. Owners saw them as both athletes and investments. Survival, skill, and performance directly impacted value. In mines, by contrast, slaves were cheap because of high mortality. Risk and lifespan were factored directly into price, highlighting the cold pragmatism of Roman economics. Legal frameworks also shaped cost. Contracts guaranteed obedience, health, and sometimes skill. Defective or ill slaves could be returned. Sellers were incentivized to present slaves carefully, balancing honesty with persuasion. Law, commerce, and human life intertwined in a system highly structured yet morally troubling. Exotic origin added another layer. Slaves from distant provinces were rarer and highly prized. Owning such individuals signaled wealth, sophistication, and social status. Prestige often outweighed practical utility, creating dramatic disparities in pricing. A rare foreigner could be worth far more than a stronger, more skilled local slave, simply because of origin and exotic appeal. Credit systems extended the market. Buyers who could not pay up front could purchase on installments, expecting labor to offset costs over time. This treated human beings as long-term assets. Age, gender, health, markings, and skills all influenced price. Even minor defects lowered value. Exceptional attributes increased it. The market was volatile. Conquests, peace treaties, famine, and social trends influenced supply and demand. Military victories could flood markets and lower prices. Peace and scarcity could drive them higher. Fashionable foreigners or rare slaves could dramatically inflate value. The market mirrored the political, economic, and social rhythms of the empire. Graffiti in Pompeii shows how normalized this was. Slave prices appeared alongside everyday items like bread or wine. Dealers openly displayed, inspected, and sold slaves. Families were torn apart. Children auctioned, adults scrutinized. To Romans, this was routine. For modern eyes, it is a haunting testament to normalized dehumanization. Ultimately, asking how much did a Roman slave cost is not just about coins, it is about power, ambition, and human suffering. Every number reflects a calculation of utility, prestige, and potential profit. Every transaction shaped the empire, reinforcing social hierarchies, fueling the economy, and sustaining the grandeur of Rome, all at the expense of human freedom. If you drift further into the markets of Rome, it becomes clear how deeply intertwined slavery was with the empire's economy and social hierarchy. Prices were not merely numbers, they were statements of value, utility, and prestige. Every transaction reflected age, gender, health, skills, obedience, and sometimes even perceived beauty. To buy a slave was to participate in a complex system of human valuation, where coins translated into labor, status, and social influence. Ordinary slaves, laborers, domestic servants, or field workers might cost between 500 and 2,000 sesterces. Skilled slaves, Greek tutors, Syrian artisans, accountants could fetch 10,000 sesterces or more. Exceptional individuals, like estate managers, doctors, or entertainers, might be valued at 50,000 sesterces. With legionaries earning roughly 900 sesterces per year, these numbers are staggering. A single elite slave could equal decades of wages, a massive investment that few but the wealthy could afford. Market conditions were volatile. Wars, such as Caesar's campaigns in Gaul or Pompey's eastern conquests, could flood markets with captives, lowering prices. Peace or scarcity could drive them higher. Social trends also mattered. Exotic entertainers or rare foreign artisans could command inflated prices simply because of fashion, rarity, or prestige. Supply, demand, utility, and social perception all converged to determine final costs. Auctions were both practical and performative. Slaves were displayed on raised platforms, sometimes lightly clothed to show physical condition. Placards outlined age, origin, skills, health, and temperament. Buyers scrutinized every detail, tested strength, and sometimes requested demonstrations. Some slaves performed tasks, cooking manual work, or reciting poetry to impress potential buyers. The process combined commerce with theater, making humans commodities in a highly calculated display. Children were bought for potential. Boys could be trained as farmhands, soldiers, or scribes. Girls for domestic work or household duties. Families were occasionally sold together, though separation was common. Buyers focused on the most promising individuals, understanding that investment in youth could yield higher long-term value. Gender influenced pricing sharply. Men were often purchased for heavy labor or skilled work. Women could command higher prices for domestic service, appearance, or refinement. Beauty and perceived obedience could dramatically increase a woman's value. The Roman market intertwined practicality with aesthetics, demonstrating the empire's complex social hierarchies. Gladiators were a high-stakes market. Young men trained for combat could cost thousands of owners viewed them as athletes and investments. Survival, performance, and skill directly influenced value. Miners were cheap because of high mortality, with price reflecting expected lifespan. Risk, performance, and labor potential were all carefully calculated. Legal protections shaped the market. Contracts guaranteed obedience, health, and sometimes skill. Buyers could return defective or ill slaves. Sellers presented individuals strategically, balancing honesty and persuasion. Law, commerce, and human life intertwined in a system both structured and deeply dehumanizing. Exotic origins increased value. Slaves from distant provinces were rare and highly prized. Ownership signaled wealth, sophistication, and status. Prestige often outweighed practical utility, creating dramatic price disparities. A rare foreigner could cost far more than a stronger, more skilled local slave simply due to origin and exotic appeal. Credit and financing widened the market. Buyers, unable to pay up front, could purchase slaves on installment, expecting labor to offset costs over time. Human beings were treated as long-term assets, with minor details age, gender, health, skills, markings affecting price. Even small defects could lower value, while extraordinary traits or appearance increased it. Market volatility was constant. Wars, peace treaties, famine, and social trends influenced supply and demand. Conquest could flood markets and reduce prices. Scarcity could drive them higher. Fashionable foreigners or rare slaves could inflate value dramatically. The market mirrored the political, social, and economic rhythms of the empire. Graffiti in Pompeii reveals normalization. Prices for slaves appeared alongside bread and wine. Dealers displayed, inspected, and sold individuals publicly. Families were torn apart. Children auctioned. Adults scrutinized. To Romans, this was routine. To modern eyes, a haunting demonstration of normalized dehumanization. Ultimately, asking how much did a Roman slave cost exposes the empire's priorities. Every number tells a story of calculation, ambition, and cruelty. Coins exchanged hands while human lives were reduced to labor potential, social prestige, and profit. The marketplace mirrored Rome itself, a civilization thriving on exploitation, hierarchy, and economic ingenuity, where freedom was measured not by law but by the number of coins one could command. If we step back and consider the Roman world as a whole, it's astonishing how normalized the buying and selling of human beings was. Slaves were integral to every aspect of life: households, farms, workshops, mines, and even entertainment. Prices reflected much more than physical ability. They were shaped by skill, age, gender, health, origin, and social perception. Each coin exchanged was a statement of value, ambition, and, ultimately, human suffering. Ordinary laborers, farmhands, cleaners, or domestic servants were typically priced between 500 and 2,000 sesterces, depending on age, health, and strength. Skilled slaves, tutors, accountants, artisans could fetch 10,000 sesterces or more. Exceptional individuals, like administrators, doctors, or entertainers, could command prices as high as 50,000 sesterces. Considering a Roman soldier earned roughly 900 sesterces per year, the purchase of a single elite slave represented decades of wages, a massive investment affordable only to the wealthy. Supply and demand dictated market fluctuations. Wars, particularly in Gaul, the East, or Britannia, could flood markets with captives, driving prices down. Peace or scarcity drove them up. Social trends also influenced value. Exotic entertainers, rare foreign artisans, or culturally refined slaves could command extraordinary sums simply because of fashion and prestige. Utility, rarity, and social perception were all intertwined in price. Auctions combined transaction with performance. Slaves were displayed on raised platforms, sometimes lightly clothed, to reveal physical condition. Placards detailed age, origin, skills, health, and temperament. Buyers scrutinized every detail, asked questions, and tested abilities. Some slaves performed tasks, cooking manual labor, or even reciting poetry to impress buyers. The system was designed to extract maximum value, turning humans into both spectacle and commodity. Children were purchased for potential. Boys could be trained for farming, military service, or domestic labor. Girls for household duties or personal service. Families were occasionally sold together, though separation was common. Buyers selected promising children, understanding that investment in youth often yielded higher long-term value. Gender was a central factor. Men were sought for heavy labor or skilled work. Women could command higher prices for domestic service, appearance, or refinement. Beauty, obedience, and perceived sophistication significantly affected value. The Roman market reflected societal priorities, intertwining utility with social aesthetics. Gladiators represented a specialized high-stakes market. Young men trained for combat could cost thousands of owners considered them both athletes and investments. Success in the arena increased value. Injury or death decreased it. Mines, by contrast, were filled with low-cost slaves, whose mortality was expected. Price reflected risk and anticipated lifespan, demonstrating the empire's pragmatic approach to human capital. Legal frameworks influenced cost. Contracts guaranteed obedience, health, and sometimes skill. Defective or ill slaves could be returned. Sellers had to carefully present slaves, balancing honesty and persuasion. Law, commerce, and human life were deeply intertwined, creating a system highly structured yet profoundly dehumanizing. Exotic origin added another layer of value. Slaves from distant provinces were rare and highly prized. Ownership signaled wealth, sophistication, and status. Prestige often outweighed utility, creating dramatic price disparities. A rare foreign slave could be worth far more than a stronger, more skilled local individual simply because of origin and novelty. Financing extended accessibility. Buyers who could not pay up front often purchased slaves on installment, expecting labor to offset costs over time. Human beings became long-term assets, with age, gender, health, markings, and skills influencing final price. Minor defects reduced value. Exceptional traits increased it. Market volatility was a constant reality. Conquests, peace treaties, famine, and social trends influenced supply and demand. Military victories could flood markets, dropping prices. Scarcity and peace could raise them. Fashionable foreigners or rare slaves could dramatically inflate value. The market mirrored the political, social, and economic pulse of the empire. Graffiti in Pompeii reveals normalization. Slave prices appeared alongside bread and wine. Dealers displayed, inspected, and sold humans publicly. Families were torn apart, children auctioned, adults scrutinized. For Romans, this was ordinary. For modern eyes, it is a haunting illustration of normalized dehumanization. Ultimately, the question, how much did a Roman slave cost, is not just about numbers. It's about calculation, ambition, and cruelty. Every coin carried a life, reinforced social hierarchy, and fueled the empire's economy. The marketplace mirrored Rome itself, a civilization thriving on labor, exploitation, and calculated human value, where freedom was a commodity, measured in sesterces. As we continue exploring the Roman markets, it becomes increasingly clear just how normalized the buying and selling of human beings was. Slavery was embedded in the very fabric of society. Prices were never simple. They reflected skill, strength, age, health, gender, origin, and even social prestige. A coin spent on a slave was a statement about wealth, ambition, and social position, and it carried the weight of another person's life. Ordinary slaves, such as farmhands or domestic servants, usually cost between 500 and 2,000 sesterces, depending on strength and condition. Skilled slaves, Greek tutors, Syrian artisans, accountants could fetch 10,000 sesterces or more. Exceptional individuals, like administrators, doctors, or entertainers, could command as much as 50,000 sesterces. Considering a legionary earned about 900 sesterces a year, these numbers are staggering. A single elite slave could represent decades of wages, an enormous investment affordable only to the wealthiest Romans. The market was influenced by supply and demand. Wars, such as Caesar's conquest of Gaul or Pompey's campaigns in the East, flooded markets with captives, reducing prices. Peace or scarcity drove them higher. Social trends and fashion also mattered. Exotic entertainers or rare foreign slaves could demand high prices simply because of desirability and prestige. In Rome, utility, rarity, and social perception were all deeply intertwined in the valuation of human lives. Auctions were part commerce, part performance. Slaves were displayed on raised platforms, sometimes lightly clothed to show physical condition. Placards described age, origin, skills, health, and temperament. Buyers scrutinized every feature, asked questions, and sometimes requested demonstrations. Some slaves performed tasks, cooking manual work, or reciting poetry to impress potential buyers. The auction was designed to extract the maximum price, turning humans into spectacles of commerce. Children were purchased for potential rather than immediate work. Boys could be trained for farming, military service, or household labor. Girls for domestic service or personal assistance. Families were sometimes sold together, though separations were common. Buyers selected the most promising children, understanding that early training could increase future value. Gender played a central role in pricing. Men were typically bought for labor or skilled work. Women could command higher prices for domestic service, appearance, or refinement. Beauty, obedience, and perceived sophistication could dramatically increase a woman's value. The Roman market intertwined practical utility with social aesthetics, revealing the values of the empire. Gladiators formed a specialized high-stakes market. Young men trained for combat could cost thousands of sesterces. Owners considered them both athletes and investments. Success in the arena increased value, injury or death decreased it. Miners, by contrast, were cheap because high mortality was expected. Risk and expected lifespan were directly factored into price, highlighting the empire's pragmatic, if ruthless, approach to human capital. Legal contracts also shaped transactions. Obedience, health, and sometimes skills were guaranteed. Defective or ill, slaves could be returned. Sellers were compelled to present individuals carefully, balancing persuasion with honesty. Law, commerce, and human life were deeply intertwined, creating a system highly structured yet morally troubling. Exotic origins increased value further. Slaves from distant provinces were rare and highly prized. Ownership signaled wealth, cultural sophistication, and social status. Prestige often outweighed practical utility, creating dramatic price disparities. A rare foreign slave could cost far more than a stronger or more skilled local individual, simply because of exotic appeal. Credit and financing extended the market. Buyers who could not pay up front could purchase on installment, expecting labor to offset costs over time. Human beings were treated as long-term assets. Minor defects reduced value. Exceptional traits, skills, or beauty increased it. Age, gender, health, markings, and temperament all influenced price. Market volatility was constant. Wars, peace treaties, famine, and social trends affected supply and demand. Conquests could flood the market and lower prices. Scarcity could drive them higher. Fashionable foreign slaves or entertainers could dramatically inflate value. The market mirrored the social, political, and economic pulse of the empire. Graffiti in Pompeii illustrates normalization. Slave prices appeared alongside bread and wine. Dealers displayed, inspected, and sold humans publicly. Families were torn apart, children auctioned, adults scrutinized. For Romans, this was ordinary. For us, it's a haunting reflection of normalized dehumanization. Ultimately, the question, how much did a Roman slave cost, goes far beyond numbers. Every coin represents calculation, ambition, and human suffering. Coins exchanged hands while lives were reduced to labor potential, prestige, and profit. The marketplace mirrored Rome itself, a civilization thriving on labor, hierarchy, and economic ingenuity, where freedom was measured in sesterces. If we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the scale and normalization of slavery in Rome is staggering. Slaves were everywhere in households, farms, workshops, mines, and arenas, and every sector had its own pricing system. Prices were never random. They reflected labor potential, skills, health, age, gender, and even aesthetic appeal. Every transaction was a statement of wealth, ambition, and social position, and every coin carried the weight of another person's life. Ordinary laborers, such as field workers or household servants, were generally priced between 500 and 2,000. Skilled slaves, like Greek tutors, Syrian artisans, or accountants, could fetch 10,000 sesterces or more. Exceptional individuals, such as administrators, doctors, or entertainers, could command prices as high as 50,000 sesterces. Considering that a legionary earned roughly 900 sesterces a year, these figures are staggering. A single elite slave could represent decades of wages, a monumental investment for a wealthy Roman family. Supply and demand influenced the market heavily. Wars, such as Caesar's campaigns in Gaul or Pompey's eastern conquests, could flood markets with captives, lowering prices. Peace or scarcity drove them higher. Fashion and social trends mattered too. Exotic entertainers, rare foreign slaves, or culturally refined individuals could command premium prices simply for prestige. In Rome, practicality, rarity, and social perception all determined value. Auctions were both transactional and performative. Slaves were displayed on raised platforms, sometimes lightly clothed, to reveal physical condition. Placards outlined age, origin, skills, health, and temperament. Buyers examined every detail, asked questions, tested abilities, and sometimes requested demonstrations. Slaves could cook, perform manual labor, or recite poetry to impress potential buyers. The system extracted maximum value, turning humans into both commodities and spectacles. Children were purchased for their potential. Boys could be trained as laborers, soldiers, or scribes. Girls for domestic work or household duties. Families were occasionally sold together, though separations were common. Buyers selected the most promising individuals. Understanding that early training increased long-term value, gender strongly influenced pricing. Men were typically bought for labor or skilled work, while women could command higher prices for domestic service, beauty, or refinement. Beauty, obedience, and perceived sophistication could dramatically increase a woman's value. The Roman market intertwined practicality with aesthetics, revealing societal priorities and hierarchies. Gladiators formed a specialized high-risk market. Young men trained for combat could cost thousands of sesterces. Owners considered them both athletes and investments. Skill, performance, and survivability directly impacted value. Mines, conversely, required cheap labor due to high mortality. Price reflected risk and expected lifespan, highlighting Rome's cold pragmatism toward human capital. Legal frameworks shaped cost as well. Contracts guaranteed obedience, health, and sometimes skill. Defective or ill, slaves could be returned. Sellers carefully presented individuals, balancing honesty and persuasion. Law, commerce, and human life intertwined, creating a structured yet morally troubling system. Exotic origin added another dimension. Slaves from distant provinces were rare and highly prized. Ownership signaled wealth, culture, and social status. Prestige often outweighed practical utility, creating stark disparities in pricing. A rare foreigner could cost far more than a stronger or more skilled local slave simply due to origin and exotic appeal. Financing extended the market. Buyers unable to pay up front often purchased slaves on installment, expecting labor to offset costs over time. Human beings became long-term assets, with age, gender, health, skills, and markings all influencing price. Minor defects lowered value. Exceptional traits, skills, or appearance increased it. Market volatility was constant. Wars, peace treaties, famine, and social trends influenced supply and demand. Conquests could flood markets, lowering prices. Scarcity could drive them higher. Fashionable foreigners or rare entertainers could dramatically inflate value. The market mirrored Rome's social, political, and economic rhythms. Graffiti in Pompeii illustrates normalization. Slave prices appeared alongside bread and wine. Dealers displayed, inspected, and sold individuals publicly. Families were torn apart. Children auctioned. Adults scrutinized. For Romans, this was normal. For modern eyes, it's a haunting reminder of normalized dehumanization. Ultimately, asking how much did a Roman slave cost opens a window into the empire itself. Numbers alone cannot convey the calculations, ambitions, and human suffering behind each transaction. Every coin exchanged represents lives reduced to labor, prestige, and profit. The marketplace mirrored Rome itself, a civilization thriving on labor, hierarchy, and economic ingenuity, where human freedom was literally measured in sesterces. The Roman slave market is a chilling testament to the empire's values, priorities, and ingenuity, revealing a society where human lives were meticulously measured, bought, and sold. from ordinary laborers to skilled artisans, from children to gladiators. Every individual carried a price, one that reflected their potential, social perception, and the whims of fortune. It is a window into the economic logic of a civilization that built its power and grandeur on the commodification of life itself. And as we finally step back from the bustling marketplaces, the auctions, and the ledgers of set, one thing becomes clear. While coins could buy labor, skill, or beauty, they could never buy dignity, freedom, or humanity. And that stark reality is the lasting legacy of the Roman slave economy, a system of calculation, ambition, and human exploitation that shaped the empire in every way imaginable.